"Will you be my mom?" Billionaire's daughter asked the poor black waitress in tears. What if kindness could bridge the deepest divides between two worlds? 8-year-old Sophie pressed her small face against the cold restaurant window, watching raindrops race down the glass while her father conducted yet another business call inside his limousine. Her designer dress felt heavy on her shoulders, but not as heavy as the emptiness in her chest. Through the steamy window of Murphy's diner, she could see a woman with gentle hands serving coffee to truck drivers and families. The woman's name tag read, Grace, and when she smiled at a crying child, something stirred in Sophie's heart that she'd never felt before. Grace moved like music, her dark skin glowing under the warm diner lights, treating every customer like family. Sophie had never seen anyone look so genuinely happy while working. Her own nannies came and went like shadows, efficient but distant. But this woman, this Grace, radiated something Sophie desperately craved. "Where are you watching from tonight?" Grace Washington had been working double shifts at Murphy's Diner for 3 years, ever since her husband Marcus died in the factory accident. At 34, she carried herself with quiet dignity, her uniform always pressed despite the long hours. The regulars loved her, how she remembered their usual orders, asked about their grandchildren, and never let anyone leave hungry if they couldn't afford their meal. Grace had dreams once of becoming a teacher, but life had different plans. Now she focused on saving every penny for her nephew Jamal's college fund, the boy she'd raised since her sister passed. Meanwhile, across town in a glass mansion overlooking the bay, Sophie Martinez lived in beautiful isolation. Her father, billionaire tech mogul Ricardo Martinez, loved his daughter deeply but showed it through expensive gifts and exclusive schools rather than presents. Sophie's mother had died when she was 3, a tragedy that left Ricardo buried in work, unable to face the grief that lived in his daughter's eyes. A parade of nannies provided care, but none provided the maternal warmth Sophie yearned for. It was Tuesday evening when fate first brought them together. Ricardo's driver had pulled into Murphy's parking lot to take an urgent call from Tokyo. Sophie, restless and curious, slipped out of the car while he wasn't looking. She pushed through the diner's heavy door, drawn by the warm light and the sound of genuine laughter. The rich aroma of apple pie and fresh coffee wrapped around her like a hug she'd never received. Grace noticed the little girl immediately, out of place in her expensive clothes, standing uncertainly by the entrance with eyes too old for her young face. Something in those eyes called to Grace's nurturing instincts. She approached gently, kneeling down to Sophie's level. "Are you looking for someone, honey?" Grace asked, her voice soft as velvet. Sophie stared into Grace's kind brown eyes and felt something crack open in her chest. For the first time in years, someone was looking at her, really seeing her, not just the billionaire's daughter, but the lonely child underneath. Before Sophie could answer, her father's driver burst through the door, panic written across his face as he spotted his missing charge. "Miss Martinez, your father is beside himself with worry." The driver's voice cut through the warm diner atmosphere like a blade. Sophie's shoulders sagged as reality crashed back down. She wasn't supposed to wander off, wasn't supposed to talk to strangers, wasn't supposed to want things that money couldn't buy. Grace watched the transformation with a heavy heart, the spark in Sophie's eyes dimming as she prepared to return to her gilded cage. But before the driver could usher her away, Sophie turned back with desperate urgency. "Will you be here tomorrow?" she whispered to Grace, her small hands gripping the edge of the counter. Grace felt her heart skip. Something in this child's voice reminded her of Jamal when he'd first come to live with her, that same desperate need for stability, for someone who wouldn't disappear. "I'll be here, sweetheart. I work every day except Sunday." That night, Sophie couldn't sleep. She stared at the ceiling of her enormous bedroom, thinking about Grace's gentle smile and the way she'd knelt down to talk to her like an equal. For the first time, someone had looked at her without calculating her father's wealth or their own advantage. Grace couldn't sleep either, troubled by the profound sadness she'd seen in Sophie's young face. She'd raised enough children in her extended family to recognize a soul crying out for maternal love. The next evening, as if drawn by an invisible string, Sophie convinced her driver to stop at Murphy's Diner again. This time, Sophie sat at Grace's section and ordered hot chocolate. Grace served it with extra whipped cream and a warm cookie, sitting across from her during a quiet moment. "What's your name, honey?" Grace asked gently. "Sophie. Sophie Martinez." The last name hung in the air like a confession. Grace's eyes widened slightly. Everyone in town knew that name, knew about the tech empire and the tragic loss of Ricardo Martinez's wife. But when she looked at Sophie, she didn't see a billionaire's daughter. She saw a little girl who desperately needed someone to care. If this moment touched your heart, please give the video a thumbs up. It was the beginning of an impossible bond that would change both their lives forever. Word travels fast in a small town, especially when it involves the Martinez family. By the third visit, whispers followed Sophie into Murphy's diner. Some customers stared, others whispered behind their hands, and Grace began to feel the weight of their curious eyes. But what worried her most was the growing attachment she felt toward this lonely child and the matching devotion she saw in Sophie's eyes. The breaking point came on a rainy Thursday evening. Sophie arrived at the diner more upset than Grace had ever seen her. Tears streamed down her cheeks as she slumped into her usual booth. "What's wrong, baby girl?" Grace asked, sliding in across from her, protocol forgotten. "Daddy's getting married," Sophie whispered, her voice breaking. "To Vivian. She says I need to start acting more mature, that I can't keep running off to diners like a common child." The words stung because Grace could hear Vivian's voice in them, cold, dismissive. Grace felt her protective instincts flare. She'd seen this before with her nephew Jamal, the way some people treated children like inconveniences rather than treasures. "And how does that make you feel?" "Scared," Sophie admitted, the honesty raw and devastating. "What if she makes Daddy send me to boarding school? What if I never see you again?" The fear in her voice was so genuine that Grace had to blink back her own tears. Without thinking, Grace reached across the table and took Sophie's small hands in hers. "Listen to me, Sophie Martinez. You are a precious, wonderful little girl. You deserve to be loved exactly as you are. Don't you ever let anyone tell you different." Sophie looked up with desperate hope. "Grace, could you ever?" She struggled with words too big for her young heart. "What is it, sweetheart? Will you be my mom?" The question came out in a whisper so soft Grace almost missed it. The diner seemed to hold its breath. Grace felt her world tilt as she looked into Sophie's hopeful, terrified eyes. This wasn't just childish fantasy, this was a soul-deep plea for the maternal love that had been missing from Sophie's life since she was 3 years old. Have you ever faced something like this, when your heart wanted something that seemed impossible? Let us know in the comments. Grace was about to face the hardest decision of her life, knowing that either choice would break someone's heart. Grace's silence stretched like eternity as she held Sophie's hands across the worn Formica table. The weight of the child's question, "Will you be my mom?" hung between them, heavy with longing and impossibility. Around them, the diner's normal evening bustle continued, but their booth felt like an island where time stood still. "Oh, sweetheart," Grace whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I wish the world worked that way. I wish love was enough to make families however we wanted them." Sophie's face crumpled, and Grace quickly moved to sit beside her, wrapping the child in her arms. "But that doesn't mean I don't love you," Grace continued softly. "Because I do. More than you know." As if summoned by the intensity of the moment, Ricardo Martinez himself walked through the diner's front door. Grace had seen his picture in the newspaper, but in person, he looked tired, older than his 45 years, carrying the weight of grief and responsibility. His eyes swept the diner until they found Sophie in Grace's embrace. Instead of anger, his face showed something Grace hadn't expected: relief, and perhaps understanding. He approached slowly, as if not wanting to break the spell of comfort his daughter had finally found. "Sophie." His voice was gentle. "We need to talk." Sophie looked up, tears still streaming. "Daddy, I asked Grace to be my mom. I know you're marrying Vivian, but she doesn't love me like Grace does." Ricardo's face went through a series of emotions: surprise, pain, and something that looked like recognition. He looked at Grace, really looked at her, perhaps seeing for the first time the woman who had given his daughter something he'd been unable to provide. "May I sit?" he asked Grace quietly. She nodded, and Ricardo slid into the booth across from them. For a long moment, the three of them sat in silence, 2 adults and 1 child, all carrying pieces of broken hearts. "I've been failing her, haven't I?" Ricardo said finally, his voice barely audible. "I thought providing everything she needed was enough. I thought if I worked hard enough, made enough money, I could somehow fill the hole her mother left." He looked at his daughter with fresh eyes. "But you found something here I couldn't give you at home." If you've been enjoying this story, subscribe to our channel for more heartwarming tales. Sophie's next words would change everything for all 3 of them. "Daddy," Sophie said with the wisdom of a child who had suffered early loss, "I don't need more toys or bigger houses. I just need someone who sees me, really sees me, the way Grace does." Ricardo reached across the table and took his daughter's free hand while Grace continued to hold the other. In that moment, something shifted between the 3 of them, an understanding that transcended social barriers and economic differences. "Grace," Ricardo said slowly, "I don't know if this is presumptuous, but would you think about coming to work for us? Not as a nanny," he added quickly, seeing her stiffen. "As family. Sophie needs what you've given her these past weeks. And honestly, I think I need to learn from you how to really see my daughter again." Grace felt her breath catch. "Mr. Martinez, I appreciate the offer, but I can't abandon my responsibilities here. My nephew Jamal, my life." "Bring Jamal too," Ricardo interrupted. "There's plenty of room, and he deserves the same opportunities Sophie has. But more than that." He paused, struggling with words that had never come easily. "I think you could teach us how to be a real family. Not just people sharing a house, but people who truly care for each other." Over the following months, something beautiful grew from that impossible conversation. Grace didn't become Sophie's mother in the legal sense, but she became something even more precious: chosen family. She moved into the Martinez home with Jamal, not as an employee but as an integral part of their lives. She taught Ricardo how to be present with his daughter, how to listen to her dreams and fears. She showed Sophie that love comes in many forms, and that sometimes the family we choose is just as powerful as the family we're born with. Ricardo eventually ended his engagement to Vivian, realizing he'd been trying to fill a void with the wrong solution. Grace pursued her teaching degree with Ricardo's support, eventually becoming a beloved educator who understood that every child, rich or poor, simply needs someone who believes in them. And Sophie? She grew up knowing she was profoundly loved by 2 people who had chosen to build something beautiful from the broken pieces of their separate stories. If you enjoyed this story, please remember to like, leave a comment with your thoughts, and subscribe for more heartwarming tales. Sometimes the most powerful question a child can ask isn't, "Why?" but, "Will you love me?" And sometimes, when we're brave enough to say yes, miracles happen in the most ordinary places. Thank you for joining us on this journey of love, loss, and the families we choose to create.